Hello and welcome to Screenworks. I'm John Uriarte, curator of digital programs at the Photographers Gallery in London. Screenworks is a program initiated by the Fotomuseum Winterthur in Switzerland and the Photographers Gallery with the support of Pro Helvetia. My colleague Marco De Mutis, digital curator at Winterthur Fotomuseum, and I started Screenworks in April 2020 as a way to respond to the pandemic, as well as to keep exploring the possibilities of the network image. Every 2 weeks, we invite artists, researchers, or curators to take over our screens to visit the spaces where their artistic practice takes place and share the work process behind it. Each event has a different format and takes the audience into a particular digital space. Some screenworks have been quite performative, others have turned into collaborative online happenings or have taken us behind the scenes of the artist practice. If you have missed any of our previous events, please visit our website, screenworks.com, or you can also visit our YouTube channel to watch the recordings of them. And some housekeeping information now. Your microphone should be muted. If not, please mute it now to avoid noise disturbances. And as I mentioned, we are recording and we will be archiving this event. So please turn off your camera if you don't want to be recorded. Please use the public chat to send any questions you might have for Thomas or for Andrew. Or you can alternatively also send a private message to Marco or to me on the public chat.
And hi from me too. My name is Marco De Mutis. I'm digital curator at Fotomuseum Winterthur. Today, we're really excited to follow the artist-researcher duo Destructionist International in their investigations and search for Clodo. This elusive group carried out a series of attacks on computer firms in Toulouse, France in the 1980s. While their identity has remained shrouded in mystery, their actions still resonate with the complex role the computational systems play in contemporary society. The difficult negotiations between military technologies and commercial algorithms embedded in popular softwares today can be traced through this historical trajectory, in which groups like Clodo resisted and acted against the rising power of computers. During the screen walk, the duo will take the audience through their digital archive, performing different files and platforms, following the detective work that culminated in their experimental film, Machines in Flames. From digitized newspaper articles and vintage photographs to video recordings of Clodo's targets. From digital maps to desktop choreographies, they will explore the possibilities and limitations of archival research. Ultimately, Destructionist International will reflect upon the tension between the very same technology that we rely upon while trying to dismantle, and the possibility to imagine an anti-archive. The Destructionist International is dedicated to the negative in all of its forms. It is driven by a shared inclination, a taste for the fury of distraction, away from the dull submission of situations to reasoned judgment. This passion helps Destructionist International maintain a militant indifference towards individuals, organization, and institutionalization of any kind. It owes its existence to radical events, those rare situations in which abolition becomes actual. The Destructionist International is composed of cultural geographer Thomas Dekeyser and media scholar Andrew Culp. Working across a variety of different media, they explore themes of militancy, sabotage, technology, and liberation. Thomas Dekeyser is a cultural geographer and filmmaker at the Center for the Geohumanities at Royal Holloway, University of London. He writes on refusal, technology, and militant histories. Andrew Culp is a media theorist and maker at the California Institute of the Arts. His writing has been published in 12 languages, including the books Dark Deleuze and A Guerrilla Guide to Refusal. Dear Destructionist International, thanks so much for being with us today. The screen is yours.
Thank you so much. Let me try and start sharing. There we go. Yeah, thank you so much, John and Marco, for the invitation to contribute and for the wonderful introduction to our work and to us as a collective. So what we'll do today is we will focus on the kind of the research practices and the research process that went into producing our experimental film called Machines in Flames. So we're going to start where we basically, we're going to start with the first moment when we heard about Clodo, the kind of the protagonist of our film. So we first come across Clodo in this interview, a self-interview that Clodo conducted, which they sent, first of all, to in 1983 to a French kind of magazine dedicated to computation called Terminal. And so we come across their sort of English translation of that interview. And so a few things then stood out to us in this interview. So first of all, their name, their Committee for the Liquidation and Subversion of Computers, which is, we learn in this interview, French slang for a homeless bum. And so they're very clear in the introduction. It becomes very clear what Clodo is obsessed with. They say, they are involved in torching or otherwise destroying computer centers. And they say in their interview, an interesting line, which is, what could be more ordinary than throwing a match on a package of magnetic tapes? So we become intrigued by this group. But on the one hand, we're not entirely surprised by this group and their activities, because they emerged in the 1980s, early 1980s, at a time when across Europe you had a variety of kind of radical leftist groups, such as Action Directe, Red Brigades in Italy, and RAF in Germany, who all were using violent means of kind of addressing the kind of economic and capitalist status quo. So in a way, sort of Clodo fits within that. But there were at the same time two things that that we found peculiar in this interview, which is, first of all, they say we are in a good position because they spell out that they are in fact computer workers. So they're not some kind of external enemy of computation. They are themselves computer workers who have turned against their kind of their place of labor. So that's the first thing that we find interesting, and that already kind of separates them from groups like Action Directe, which very much have a sort of which seem to come very much from the outside rather than having this kind of internal position that Clodo seems to hold. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we find out that this interview was conducted after their very last attack. And so they very proudly state that they were never caught. Again, this is different to all these other groups and across Europe around that time, who all were either killed in their own actions or were imprisoned for very long periods of time. And so Clodo instead, was never caught, and they say, they take great pride in it, and they say, we know much more about the state than they know about us. And so, they are very much kind of focusing on and celebrating their own invisibility, which, what I found interesting about that is that it's very much at odds. Their kind of politics of invisibility seems very much at odds with kind of contemporary politics based around recognition, campaigning, particularly when we think about kind of digital politics. So these are the sort of two main things that I think stood out for us initially and that we found intriguing. And then, kind of we were intrigued, and that's when we decided, okay, we need to know more about this group. And that's the point at which we start kind of digging into the digital archive, i.e. the internet.
We initially communicated about this, not surprisingly, over Facebook Messenger and other digital platforms, and noted that it seemed really ripe for investigation. And this was in the depth of the pandemic. And so we couldn't go to a library or see stacks of information or even really check out books. And so, of course, the first thing that we did was go online. But it's not uncommon from the way in which research tends to begin today as well, where the first impulse is to look to the internet because it really seems to be the place where we archive all of our most easily accessible information, and that we wanted to see what other people had thought and found about them before. And in fact, the Wikipedia page is more thorough than it was previously, in part because of the research that we ourselves did, which maybe is a bit of a paradox or a challenge that we're going to need or want to speak about later. Because in taking up the ideas of Clodo, we didn't necessarily want to feed the thing that they were so critical of themselves, which is the internet and computation and these deep digital archives. So, of course, Wikipedia is a first source. It's open, it's relatively free, it exists in multiple languages. And a few things sort of stood out to us initially, though we'll talk about it in more depth later, which is that Clodo as an organization was unlike other militant groups operating at the time. The more we investigated, the more we found out that there was something unique or singular about their approach that deserved deeper investigation. Trying to categorize them became difficult, and we could see that through some of the different work that was done in and how it was referenced in other materials. They maybe were anarchists, maybe they weren't anarchists. Were they libertarians? Were they Luddites? Were they militants? And through more of our investigation, the inability to categorize who they were seemed most interesting. And then to see that they engaged in maybe 5, maybe 10, maybe more than a dozen attacks, the deeper that we looked, we found out they were more and more prolific than we had initially imagined. And it was interesting to even find and connect the dots for that information, because it seemed like no one had yet collected or put together that material. And so we were first grabbed even just by the images to see these charred computers in this transitionary period between when computers were the size of whole rooms, not yet a personal computer that were open and accessible to everybody, and the brilliant sort of spectacular images that came out of it. The fact that they had graffiti, that they had these photographs in newspapers, it seemed absolutely important to us. And then when we started looking in other parallel versions of the archive, like Google Books, they started showing up in anti-terrorist literature. And so there's a very particular sense in which people who study anti-terrorism are generally criminologists, if not actually the police themselves. They're coming up with policies and plans in order to control terrorism. And we started seeing connections that we'll explore more between anti-terrorism and computation or computational thinking. And so it seemed like Clodo was almost an image in relief of these various anti-terrorism investigations. And the anti-terrorism researchers themselves had almost no understanding of who Clodo was. They seemed uninterested in finding out more material. Perhaps they repeated some of the most spectacular claims, but in fact, their referencing was usually very poor. They're often referencing others who were referencing others and not double checking translations. And so that only added to the myth of Clodo, as that there was this insinuating, gossipy, mythic character of all of the claims about who they were that made us want to find out more. And additionally, there are people who claimed connections between Clodo and other groups such as Action Direct or others, but we found all those claims more and more dubious, in the same way in which perhaps conservatives want to draw connections between Antifa and all these other sort of larger than life groups that may or may not actually exist. And we found that there was even subcultural literature like Tumblr, where people left little pieces of information about Clodo, but
that's probably the end of Andrew's internet. I'll continue, and I'm sure he'll return. And so we found these websites, like including Tumblrs, in which people just kind of really celebrate the activities that Clodo undertook. It was almost like these kind of fan pages for Clodo, in which you get this celebration of these different of the different actions they undertook, with like contemporary images of similar attacks. And so this becomes really interesting to us. So at the same time, there's very little information about Clodo available online. What is there is very superficial. At the same time, you do have this interesting legacy that leads to people wanting to know more about them, despite there being so little available online. And so you end up in a situation where people just kind of reproduce the same images over and over again, and the same facts over and over again. And so, at some point we feel like we've hit a wall. Like we feel like, okay, we've done the digital research that we're able to do. We've found these books, we found these articles, we found the 4 images that exist of Clodo. We found the one interview, sort of recorded interview with a supposed expert on Clodo. And so, we decided, okay, if we actually want to understand more than the questions, okay, when did Clodo undertake their attacks? Where did they take it? What did they do? If we actually want to know more about Clodo, we have to dig much deeper. And so we decide to reach out to we find basically this this archive in Toulouse which is a really old school website called Centre de Recherche pour l'Alternative Sociale. And so this is like this kind of geeky archival space in south of France, which has this abundance of information about kind of radical politics in southern France, and particularly the Toulouse region. And to our great astonishment, they claim that they have a dossier specifically on Clodo. And we were like, okay, we didn't know there was more out there because there's so little available online. And so so we write to them and they go, okay, we can pass on the dossier if you want. And so we're obviously gassed and we're like, yeah, please send us everything you've got. And so this is, then we start receiving various materials. So first of all, we get all these images of attacks by Clodo. And so from this, we start getting this visual sense of what Clodo was doing, how they conducted their attack. For example, here you can see these kind of like tapes lying on the ground that were burned in the bathroom. So that's sort of one method that they used. Another point, for example, for this attack, we can see that they actually used explosives rather than burning particular computers or magnetic tapes or punch cards or anything like that. And so, we start building this kind of visual archive of Clodo's attacks between 1980 and 1983. And we're just like really excited because we had just been coming across the same old images on Getty. And so this is kind of like a new stage for us. And then we kind of beside images, we obviously get actual articles about this elusive group. And there's quite a few things that we could learn from these articles. So first of all, we get a sense of kind of how people actually responded to Clodo at the time. So we get these articles in which sort of, I guess, the equivalent of The Sun today, but then in The Sun or like similarly sensational kind of newspapers, they immediately claimed Clodo are terrorists. What they are trying to do is to paralyze the economy. And so we see all these articles in which, Clodo is sort of like blown up as like this internal enemy of the economy, of the French national economy. But we also start getting a sense of how computer firms themselves responded to the Clodo attacks. So for example, in this article, we read that the director of Philips, and Philips is Philips Data Systems was one of the first firms to be bought by Clodo. And so we learned that we learn about, first of all, the kind of the director follows the same narrative, claiming that these are terrorists, but he also says they are not just vandals, they are experts. They knew exactly what they were doing. They came in just when there was no one around. They came in and violated exactly those elements that are most dear to us. And so he starts like sketching out this image of Clodo, while at the same time also entirely trying to negate what Clodo were doing. And so that's kind of like the corporate response that we start getting an understanding of. Besides that, we also learned that at the time, the police were obviously aware of Clodo. They were trying to catch them specifically by positioning themselves outside of potential new targets of Clodo. So they had mapped out those firms that they thought would possibly be attacked next by Clodo. And so then they would sit outside in a car, basically hoping to catch Clodo as they walk up to a firm or jump a fence or climb through a window. They tried to they arrested pretty much what seemed like a random set of people who had been critiquing technology, broadly speaking, in Toulouse. And so I guess they try and sort of, kind of close the net and try and find people who may somehow be related to Clodo. But perhaps more interesting than those responses to Clodo was that of the Communist Party, in which they immediately denounced the attacks. And they said, for us, nothing justifies breaking the tools of labor. It's not progress that's our enemy, that's the enemy of the worker, but the way it's currently been utilized. So it's a kind of a capitalist critique of technology without Clodo's kind of desire to destroy it in the first place. And I find, to me at least, this stood out as quite interesting, because it sort of helps us think about how Clodo, if they were around today, how kind of large political parties would likely respond to them as well. And then, another kind of article that we found is basically a communiqué written by Clodo, in which they explain with a little bit more detail what it is that they are attacking. So they say, our society of if, go to, squared, codified, aligned, controlled, this society where we connect like trains in a rail yard, where the binary and the quantitative are supposed to solve the crisis, this society in which we live is unbearable and inhuman. And so they particularly apply this in their communiqué to the way that the police around the time was beginning to introduce computation and more broadly kind of cybernetic logics as a way of gathering not just information about criminals, but predicting criminal activity. So here we're starting to get a proper sense of what Clodo were kind of addressing through their text. And something else we find out from these communiques is that there's around the time, around the late 60s, France had approved what was called the Plan Calcul. The Plan Calcul was this governmental funding program in which the French government was pushing loads and loads of money into the computer industries in France in order to get international kind of a privileged position in this sort of, the computer arms race. And so Clodo was, needs to be understood within that context of a governmental push towards increased computation within both industry, but also within the military. And this is something that they point out in their communiques, which is that they position computers as inherently killing machines. So they say that computation and militarization are intimately connected to the points that one cannot separate one from the other. And kind of two final things that kind of immediately stood out from these interviews is that Clodo, according to journalists at least, seem to have emerged from a particular struggle that took place in Toulouse around the time, which is when where there was all kinds of resistance to the building of a new nuclear plant called Golfec. And so there were lots of different groups kind of involved in trying to prevent this nuclear plant from being built, but realizing that their kind of like non-violent protests weren't really going anywhere, they decided to kind of pick up other means. And this is the moment at which we see not just Clodo, but other groups have taken other forms of direct actions, including bombing firms that were related to the building of the nuclear plants. And the last link that we found interesting is that in this article, they talk about how Clodo appears to reproduce the same logics and the same means of a group that was called Gary. And Gary was basically a French anti-Franco group, so made up of people who had fled, kind of anti-Franco, anti-fascists who had left Spain to kind of flee prosecution. And so there's all these kind of suggestions in these articles that Clodo was a kind of an offshoot of Gary. So that was all the articles. So as you can see, we've kind of like been overwhelmed by all this information, and we start asking ourselves, you know, what do we do with all this information? And I think this is the point at which we actually start moving beyond just gathering information. We start actually kind of producing our own documents in which we produce connections that weren't previously there. We start producing new structures that weren't initially there in order to like pull out new insights. Because obviously as researchers, we can't just kind of feed back to people what is already out there. And so the first thing we do is we produce this document in which we basically collect all the information we could find about the different attacks of not just Clodo, but other groups who were conducting similar attacks around the time, including Red Brigades, RAF in Germany, and so on. And what this allows us to do is that we start seeing patterns, right? We start understanding that Clodo wasn't just a kind of sole figure undertaking these actions. There were other groups like the Cellule Communiste Combattante in Belgium, who had in fact attacked the exact same companies, like Honeywell Bull. It's just one example. And but we also start getting a sense that across these groups, there might be a level of coherence that we hadn't previously kind of understood. Just by bringing all this together, we start, gaining these new insights. And we also learn that Clodo themselves didn't just often attack the same computers. These other groups, kind of ultra-left groups, were also exactly like targeting very similar computers, which in turn led us to get new understandings of what exactly it was that they were after. And so, so at this point, we're like, okay, we've got all this information. We have a sense of we start getting a deeper sense of what it was that Clodo was doing, their connections to other groups, both local and international. And so we start mapping out where Clodo conducted their attacks. So we learned that in the center, they attacked Sperry Univac. They attacked Honeywell Bull in the center as well. Then they attacked the International Computers Limited. So we start by mapping this out on, geographically mapping this out, we start getting an understanding as well of the geographical political interests of Clodo. They for example, they seem to have been really interested in this region around the airports, which we found out is where lots of the kind of the military and both the military and tech companies of that time were very much situated. And then kind of again, centrally, there's again this kind of cluster of attacks that took place. And so, you know, at this point, we're like, okay, we've begun to really kind of map out what Clodo was doing, the different connections that were there between the different groups. And, you know, I think we start understanding that there is, you know, that there is something, you know, inherently interesting about Clodo, but there was also a kind of paradox that we wanted to, you know, that we realized and that we wanted to work through. Are you back, Andrew? Great.
Yes, absolutely. So as we started working through this material, there ended up being a very deep question that we started asking ourselves in a sort of lucid, sober moment of reflection, where we were worried or concerned that by using the precise devices, we were entering into the world that Clodo themselves tried to prevent from emerging. And we were worried that even simply using computers, building spreadsheets, and using this sort of database logic that is so present in our contemporary moment, that even if we found interesting elements about Clodo, we were doing the precise thing they wanted us to avoid. And so we started looking back to find other ways to get to the material, to talk about it in a way to maybe escape some of the problems. And so we created a term and then tried to investigate it in a very deep, in its deep time, to find these other alternatives and potentials. So the term is the policing impulse. And we understood that computers themselves were born out of a policing impulse. And we wanted to look at ways in which that policing impulse is subverted, sometimes very intentionally, and sometimes through the medium itself in its own deconstruction. And this brought us philosophically back to, you know, popular works on archives. We can think of the deconstructionist tradition like Jacques Derrida in Archive Fever, or some of the work Giorgio Agamben has done on the archive. And we traced back this question of the archive, which is actually a Mycenaean word that comes through the Greeks. And it means a city magistrate, a governor, a civic building, and also then those buildings that hold documents. And it's from which we would think of architecture as a way of building up this archive and the command and control and authority that is government and magistrates, but also the archive itself as a representation of a form of evidence that's used to establish judgment and to separate those who are good citizens from those who need exclusion or punishment. And so the first film that we'd looked at for a moment when I was discussing this was of an event in the early history of cinema when it was still celluloid. And it was the vault of the Fox films that spontaneously combusted on July 18th, 1935. It was a very hot day in New Jersey, and without any provocation, the films themselves, because of the material that was used in early cinema, simply exploded. By the time the fire was finally put out, a considerable amount of the films were lost, and crucial films that were part of the original Fox studio lineup have never been found in their full version ever since. And so for people, archivists in particular, who maybe share with police this notion of tracking things down, preserving them in their entirety, using them as evidence of something, this of course is a great loss. But for us, it was an interesting question. How could the archy itself or an archive be subverted? And so for us, we realized that an archive or celluloid or film in the long run is eventually going to disappear. It requires a very active preservation process that itself may not even work in the end. And so we finally understood what we were doing by making a film, that we were both contributing this history, but perhaps also contributing to this act of subversion. And so we understood that celluloid has the sort of ambiguous material in which it works, and we wanted to pull out some of those potentials. And then we found that we also wanted to go into the deep history of computation, and that it's tied to this approach and this world building and this thinking of World War II, in which computers really get invested by the military and they get made practical, thinking not only of Alan Turing, but Norbert Wiener and cybernetics, and all these other ways, like the corporations and businesses that start using computers, are all inspired by this approach called operations research, which really came of age during World War II. And the style of thinking is what we would see in flowcharts, in systems thinking, in spreadsheets. And it imagines everything to be part of a complex system that is held together by small pieces. And that the form of thinking that happened during the war was that if they could find one of those small pieces, like a linchpin, and remove it, then the whole of the opposition, in this case Nazi Germany, and their war machine would fall apart. And so in this film that we're showing here, for instance, it was a promotional film about operations research, in which they said that ball bearings, but also perhaps pins or screws, were necessary for everything like a tank or an airplane to be made. And if it was located, like the British and the Americans thought that ball bearing production was located in a single place, that if all of the ball bearing factories were blown up in a single glorious bombing raid, that in fact the war could be won without any of the difficulty of a protracted war. The deep irony that we found out when looking at the situation, though, is the bombing raid itself was partially successful, but this form of thinking, the silver bullet notion that you can just take one element out and the whole house comes tumbling down, did not work. And in fact, Germany had accumulated a considerable amount of ball bearings in which the bombing itself wouldn't have ever had an impact. Yet this form of thinking becomes ubiquitous after the war. So it becomes adopted not only in the computational industry, becomes adopted in the social sciences through the forms of modeling and statistical reason that are used. It helps drive the computer industry in France and elsewhere. And it gives a new form of the archival impulse, or a form of strategic thinking that computers themselves are really bringing to everyone, even consumers, as we adopt computers in everyday life, as we all use computers to do work, as we use computers to communicate and connect to each other. And so this idea of having a strategic strike at things, we realized was the wrong approach, and it was not how we should be exploring Clodo, that we shouldn't be trying to locate any individual event, any individual bombing, that there was no truth that we would reveal from it that would then give us some sort of amazing expose, some amazing logic. And in fact, that though militant groups at the time did have that sort of logic, like if you look at the Red Brigades and their communiques for why they were bombing computer factories, or if you look to other groups that were attacking information firms, they thought that they were going to remove the one key piece in the long chain of imperialism, which is a sort of Leninist logic. And when we looked at Clodo, they seemed too playful. They seemed interested in a whole way of life. They were thinking about worlds, and they didn't have any, they didn't have the hubris to think that they would end the long march of computation, but instead they were opening up holes or other approaches in the moment in which it was advancing. And so in contrast, we realized we would have to go to Toulouse ourselves. We would have to be there. we would have to uncover a different logic. And the two competing logics that we were looking at was very interesting, because we realized that the police themselves didn't just collect dossiers and information. They didn't just make maps or build profiles on who Clodo were, even though we did that. And we realized that that would only take us so far. But they also engaged in stakeouts. They were there on the ground. They wanted to do things. And so as we realized that we were going to bring our camera and be engaged in the stakeout as well, we had to ask this question of how to fight the policing impulse and ask, what is the difference between a stakeout that we would do as filmmakers, and how would that stakeout be different than the form of stakeout that the police would do? And we began with this sort of realization that the police are looking for action. They're looking for a moment. They're looking to catch people in the act. They're looking to find people. And for us, or for even Clodo, as we sort of became them and staked out the buildings that were attacked, we didn't want to seek out people and seek out action. We wanted to come like a thief in the night when nobody was there, when nothing was going on, maybe to have one dramatic moment and then leave before anyone else arrived. So we're showing some film here of an interesting moment. I mean, we have these very long durational shots. Sometimes there's some movement from the filmmaker, sometimes there isn't. And in this particular one, after a long sort of stakeout, this is one of the last scenes that's depicted, a car comes into the parking lot, and it was uncertain who that car was. Perhaps they were security. Perhaps they were simply someone coming to pick up some work late at night, though let's hope not. And as they start walking around, the chance of a confrontation emerges. And that's when we know that what Clodo themselves would do is they would leave. They would return. They would fade back into the fabric of the streets of Toulouse. And so it's both an important climax within the film, but it's also a moment in which we knew that art of distances had to be played in order to diffuse the conflict. So it could be one at a different moment and at a different time.
Yeah, I'm just going to let some more of this run from another side.
I'm not sure if we have the time to show it, but to prepare for these, we did extensive Google Street View research. We actually found Airbnbs by matching up windows with Street View footage of seeing where we could stay if we wanted to have a long surveillance. We actually found an Airbnb overseeing this location, for instance. It made us think of that famous film, The Conversation, 70s paranoia films that involve surveillance and watching, or even Michael Haneke's Caché. But we also were very circumspect about the position of the camera. So in The Conversation, that form of surveillance is state security surveillance. It's militarized, it's governmentalized, and we wanted the opposite. We wanted to wonder, what is a militant form of surveillance? What is a criminal form of surveillance? How would those differ visually? And how would that alternate subjective orientation change the way in which the film is made and viewed? And the other was how to match film with the experience of a stakeout, which is generally very boring. You're often just sitting there waiting for something interesting to happen or recording the patterns of rhythms of people going through everyday lives. And so in fact, we just give a taste of it within the 50-minute film. Here in this shot, we can see people out on their balconies and they're cleaning up, they're doing laundry, they're vacuuming their home. And if we were really doing a stakeout, we would maybe do it every night for a week or two. And we just watch people's rhythms. We'd chart them down. We'd make a really big catalog of how to avoid people or who maybe we could learn in order to maybe even seek out as an ally, as an exit or a safe house or a spot to go to in a place of emergency. And so it also differed between each location as to what the potential conflict might be. The first being in an industrial district in which there are a lot of trucks and commodities and capitalism. This in the old city near civic centers in which there are people around. This is the image of an industrial district, which surprisingly we thought would be abandoned at night, but it turned out that it was a truck checkpoint. And so there were not only a lot of trucks going out as they were being weighed and their papers were being checked all throughout the night, but many truckers would then park their trucks on this otherwise silent street and sleep and take time to themselves. And so in fact, during shooting, Thomas was confronted by some truckers.
Huh? No. Too late. Let's go.
That was me trying to get away in my terrible French.
And then, of course, there were other sites we didn't go to because we thought they would be too securitized. So the airport was a particular point of concern. It was a deep part of the post-war development process in which Airbus really had a foothold within Toulouse in through its mechanization, industrialization, and computerization. But we realized that it would cause a potential security response that we wouldn't be prepared to address. But of course, Clodo, we imagine then, must have been locals. They must have known the streets in the area well enough where they felt like they were on they would have the advantage against whatever security forces that would try and stop them. And so that also led us to challenges with a third location, which was behind a gate. It was in a courtyard. And we weren't even able to identify which of the 3 or 4 buildings there that the attacks really occurred. We even had questions of how they got in. We imagined they jumped the gate. We knew that we could use traditional hacking and penetration testing or urban exploration techniques if we really wanted to tailgate some of the cars into the courtyard and spend some time there. But it seemed like it would be more interesting and helpful to keep that distance, because the distance really caused a lot of the tension. It caused the interest, it caused the concern. Whereas if we were to really find the precise site now 40 years after the attack, that maybe it wouldn't even be as interesting. And this we took from, the car chase, the night car chase in a film like Drive, or other sort of very classic Hollywood aesthetics, where we realized that, the action itself is in the waiting or the anticipation, and to just move as quickly as possible to the location of the object would not get us what we needed or what it wanted. It wouldn't give us the time of reflection. It wouldn't give us the time of thought.
Yes, I think throughout all this, we started, still thinking about the police and how at the beginning of the 1980s, they were sitting in their cars, doing something very similar to what we're doing here, which is, to wait basically for, for someone to arrive and just to do a stakeout, kind of police stakeout of the scene. And so we're still aware at this moment that in doing these stakeouts, we might still be reproducing some of this policing impulse that we described. Andrew, do you want to continue and talk about kind of our fears of like creating a renewed interest in Clodo?
Yeah, absolutely. So Clodo got off. They disappeared. And, in a broad conceptual sense, we realized that, Clodo may have been constituted out of people, but itself as an entity, as a becoming, as an existence, it emerged out of a particular moment, out of a constellation of forces, out of a series of tensions, and then it disappeared as they moved on or as they transformed. And so Clodo, in our sense, doesn't exist. They were only possible in that sort of moment. And in fact, in a new constellation of forces, a new becoming or a new group would emerge as well, maybe during a riot or a urban uprising, phenomena that are more common today that maybe exist in a less militant period than the 70s or the early 80s. And so we had two concerns. One was a very practical one, which is as we create renewed interest in Clodo, we certainly don't want anyone to go to jail, to get caught, or to have their lives negatively affected. But then also the larger conceptual question is, what good is cinema? Should we even produce a documentary? Like, what is the interest or obsession with documentary? And so the naive approach to documentary, of course, is often tied to a genre like the expose, in which it assumes that there is ignorance or naivete on an issue, and that if you simply add more information, then people will know more information, act differently, and stop whatever terrible horror is going on. So these are the sort of low rent exposés that often get put on television about some moral issue that's going on in society at a time. And we knew that, you know, no one feels this way about computers, and they likely don't feel this way about computation either. Clodo is not a group that needed to be exposed or for there to be just simply more information garnered about them. And on the other hand, we realized that we didn't want to simply celebrate them or ensconce them in some sort of radical history either. In fact, what we wanted was we wanted people to pick up the impulses and the desires and the interests that drove Clodo and imagine new ways in which they might be relevant or creatively inspired to take different forms of action in the present, which may have nothing to do with bombs or fire or dynamite, but still find a way of subverting the forms of computation that had taken over in our lives. And so that meant we moved beyond even the names or the locations or the events in any deep sense. And instead, we tried to become Clodo, as it were, to see what their passions were, to see what would have motivated them to do these series of attacks, and to really explore it on a deep subjective sense. So the viewer could ask themselves similar questions and then perhaps be moved or motivated to take those actions, rather to simply sit behind a screen or together in a theater, glassy-eyed, taking this information, pat themselves on the back for now knowing another chapter in the deep, long history of radical traditions, and just go on to the next thing. We didn't want it to be consumed. We wanted people to be inspired.
Yeah, and so our aim, you know, in producing the film has been to, at least partially, is to, you know, to sabotage the documentary as a genre, in which one, as Andrew already mentioned, you know, kind of fills in the gaps of history in order to create a picture that is whole, understandable, and you know, can be sort of positioned within a particular longer history. And so, you know, we're trying to subvert that. And so, in doing that, our aim has been to not debunk conspiracies, because that's the kind of, you know, the forensic logic that we wanted to avoid. But I guess to create our own, to create new conspiracies. And so I guess the sort of question we want to leave everyone with here today is, you know, how would one go about kind of undermining the digital archive today, given the ways that computation has fundamentally altered, how its materiality has altered, how omnipresent it has become, the role it plays in our lives has fundamentally intensified. And so that's the question we want to, I guess, leave you all with, and would like us, you know, we would love to hear thoughts on this. How does one destroy the contemporary archive?
That's just a parenthetical. As you watch the film, there are these moments in which the computational system makes itself obvious, but through error, through interruption, through disruption. The documentary seems to break down, just like the Foxfire archive did, or the Fox archive did, the computer needs to reboot, a spinning beach ball interrupts the icon, and the film freezes, or these moments in which the footage shows down and you actually see the filmmaker for an instant. And we see those as the way in which we can interrupt this constant flow of information in our lives and force ourselves to think in those sort of rare moments of where things break down and perhaps there's frustration, but once you get over the frustration or your flow gets interrupted, you can suddenly start to think, why was I doing this? Is it necessary? Sometimes you simply get up and get a drink of water, but if it continues, you start asking yourself, well, do I really need to do this? Is this something that I need to complete today? How much is this really worth what we're doing? And as it's been screened, we note that when people watch it on their individual devices, numerous people say that they think that their computer was sort of stopping and breaking down and they have to sort of close and open the film up again. And for us, when it's even been screened in big screens, people occasionally think there's something going wrong. And it's those moments of interruption that we think are something that can encourage us to ask big, deep, and searching questions. And so I'll sort of repeat the question as Thomas posed it. Through the image or through all kinds of other strategies and tactics, how do we question the archive? How do we question the role of technology that's taken for granted? And what are the forms of making that we can do that can continue that process of subversion that's appropriate to our current moment, that will hopefully open up a new, radical, different future that is more deserving?
This takes an hour and 40 minutes, so we can wait.
Thank you both for the amazing presentation. It's been really interesting to hear you both. Marco and I were talking behind the scenes. If your sudden disappearance, Andrew was also part of this performance, trying to make people ask if this was a mistake or it was on purpose or was part of the performance or not. I mean, you don't need to. I think that you don't even need to reply to that if you don't want to. I was also thinking. I had like a few questions on my mind about the presentation that you had. Maybe the easiest and more straightforward one will be like if you had the chance to meet with someone from Clodo today. I mean, maybe not what you would like to ask. That also maybe that's a question to have, but also what do you think that they will make of the how computation has evolved since they made their attacks? I'm not sure if they will think that their worst nightmares have come true, or what will be like their point of view. I know that you cannot put your mind on your heads, but that will be like an interesting thought, I think. Well, and then I have some other questions, but I will leave them for later, maybe.
Yeah, maybe I'll respond to the first question first. We've been thinking a lot about whether, whilst producing the film, is our end goal, our sort of ideal situation, is that an interview with someone from Clodo? Like, is that something that A, is feasible, and B, is desirable? And given the extent to which they covered themselves in anonymity, how far they went to cover their own traces, I think, kind of on the basis of that, we decided that our approach wasn't going to be one in which we try and get the truth from, someone who was actually involved with Clodo. So, and this goes back to something Andrew raised around distancing, is this is kind of, I think there was a value in exactly kind of subverting the impulse of trying to hear from Clodo what it was that they were trying to do. And there is even a chance that they would have absolutely zero interest in speaking to us, precisely for the very reason that, the reason that we discussed around their impulse towards anonymity. The fact that they dissolved after 3 years of attacks without being arrested and without writing any biographies or anything, like leaving no traces, but just their attacks and 3 communiques. That's all they've left us with. And, you know, I think for me at least, the kind of the ethical thing is to leave it at that.
There's a deep question about what it is to make and to use images too, that we can wrap around those very practical concerns. Maybe I'll give an anecdote first. There's a famous case that happened here in the United States, maybe about 15 years ago, in which there were university researchers at the University of Iowa interested in the Animal Liberation Front, which is and was a group that would break into research laboratories that were testing on animals and free those animals, among some other things. Very high profile, happens throughout Europe and the world as well. And those researchers were collecting interviews and other material from people who were attested ALF members who were engaged in deeply risky criminal behavior. And the FBI wanted access to that information. And suddenly the researchers themselves became a target simply because they held this a connection, an explicit connection between themselves and the people doing the political action. And so there's a sort of impossible position you put yourself in as you commit to a form of empirical research. And so this leads to this larger question that I alluded to previously, which is like, what is the purpose of the image? Is it to document? Is it empirical? Does it literally take a slice of the world and represent and make it available to others? Certainly, this is what leads to the prosecutorial or the evidentiary obsession with photographs and images, the reason why videos are played in court and they're treated as seemingly objective. And that was not our goal for the film at all. For us, we didn't want to evince or represent Clodo in this documented, evidentiary, empirical sense. For us, our philosophy of the image is to actually undo or undermine what is given. And for us, what was given was the ubiquitousness of computers, the fact that they seem everywhere and all powerful and always able to keep expanding. And so we end the film not in the climax of an interview with Clodo, but with the climax of there are more attacks going on right now. Maybe there's a new group that is working in the footsteps of Clodo, a huge server center in Strasbourg burned in the moment in which we were putting together some of these film materials. And we also, say in the film that we had heard from others that there are other attacks going on. And for us, we don't know.
In fact, following up on that, and while we don't wait for some questions from the audience, well, you were talking about this idea of the silver bullet, of the this one action that will take the whole system down. It reminded me to the Evergreen cargo ship stuck in the Suez Canal, or also like the recent shortage on microprocessors and all these kind of small, well, not small, but like these problems, like very located or situated problems that have spread throughout the system, like taking it like partially down for a while. So I was wondering if the strategy, maybe it wouldn't work at that time in the Second World War, also because the systems in which they were living were not so on the limit as they are today, or that's the feeling that I have on this, that we are pushing the boundaries of the systems, and particularly the systems of computation as well. And I was wondering, would those strategies work today better than at that time? Would that be a good strategy of subversion and attacking these kind of systems?
It's an interesting series of questions that we have also tried to reflect on. And I think one thing that has changed in terms of when Clodo conducted their attacks, they were burning down data they were burning down magnetic cards and other materials that when those were burned, they were gone. That they would never be retrieved, which is why the damage to these computers was very, very high. And they literally said it will take us, like Director Phillips said, it will take us literally months to like get back on track after this attack. And so what we see today is obviously that data exists not just digitally, but exists in all these different spaces at the same time, which is not to say that when a computer server is sort of burns down, nothing is lost, but at most the website is down for a few hours until, you know, the backup that it already exists somewhere else has been activated. And so there's in terms of computation, there's an interesting question around what it means to undertake these attacks today when computation has become omnipresent, but it has also sort of distributed in the way that storage functions, for example, which raises interesting questions for groups that are today undertaking these actions. Like, as I see it, the kind of effects that they can have, in terms of material effects at least, delays they can cause, is much more narrow, which is not to say that other elements of logistical capitalism cannot be sabotaged and create, you know, like you give the example of that ship, that might be a situation in which that actually it has these kind of ongoing effects. So as computation is perhaps something slightly different because of the way that storage has altered, the way that the internet enables you know, this kind of ongoing existence of these materials.
You're absolutely right that logistics is a great example of this systems and efficiency thinking. I absolutely, you know, agree with Thomas that there's a variety of realms in which we need to consider it too. So within capitalist commodity chains, they're getting increasingly long. And so if they get interrupted at any one stage, it can really change things. So that's what we're seeing with current supply chain crises. And some of it is that timeframes were initially made very narrow through things like lean production or just in time, where people decided to reduce how many products they would keep in a warehouse. And so they would keep very lean stock, and they would then just depend on a constant shipment. And so if that shipment gets interrupted, or the other forms of supply get interrupted, it would really hurt their ability to provide products. So yeah, it does happen. But I think one of the challenges with this strategic thinking is people become a little overly confident in thinking that they found a single linchpin that could really like make things topple. Because while, you know, the evergreen, everlane disruption did happen in the Suez Canal, and some firms went out of business and people couldn't get their shoes or their paper bags or whatever for a few weeks, it certainly didn't end capitalism. And so it might create inefficiencies within the system, but what is the consequence? You know, here in the United States, as I'm sure it is in other places, corporations respond by raising prices, and there's incredible inflation, or it even just becomes an alibi or an excuse to do it. So I think what Clodo did is, instead of doing a strategic form of thinking that this is the right target, thinking of it like a game in chess, where if you capture the king, then you win the whole game, they instead saw it as a way of life. They said, you know, struggling against these things is a way of reclaiming their own agency or subjectivity in the moment. They didn't think that it would end the computation in general, but they found it as a sense of duty. It changed how they thought about themselves, and it probably shifted the culture and the social fabric of their milieu in their region in doing so. It made people working at those firms scared, and they wanted them to be scared. It incensed the government and the military, and they saw that as an end to itself, probably. One last thing, we wanted to also consider a computational term about this that might be interesting. There's something that's called the Doherty threshold, which is about the latency of an input and the computer device itself. So like how fast after you type a command or even type in the terminal, it shows up. That was something that was finally surpassed in the 80s. And it was, once something is quick enough, then people will sit at the terminal. However, if you had to type something in and it took more than, I think it's 400 microseconds, people would get bored. So you type it in, you'd like get bored, you'd step away, you'd do something else, and then you'd come back and type another command. So there is a potential that if you introduce enough noise or enough delay or enough of an interruption, that people will get unglued from their devices. They will no longer feel like they're in a flow state, and they'll then inhabit a completely different subjective relation to it. So I'm sure everyone experiences this when, you know, the internet just isn't working for a second and you're like browsing something and suddenly something like slows down, and then you like think for a moment. You're like, oh geez, what was I doing? Why do I even care if I get to this website or not? And so I think that what Clodo can do, or these other interruptions, maybe not even bring down the whole system, but they can be these moments of reflection, or they can be these moments in which thought finally sort of creeps in. And, you know, as a creative, rather than someone, you know, with a gun or a bomb, this is really, you know, our most effective weapon or tool too.
Thanks a lot also from my side. And I also wanted to say that to anyone who has the chance to watch the film, please go and do so, because it's really fantastic. And although we've seen a lot of behind the scenes today, this was a very performative behind the scenes and also very self-reflexive desktop performance. Thanks so much also for doing this specifically for us. I think the events and the next screenings are on machinesinflames.com, if I'm correct. So make sure if you can catch one that is close to you, I really recommend it. I wanted to say also that so in the film, there's a voiceover, which is not you, but there's this also nice moment where we're watching something that feels like a noir detective film. And then suddenly it's like the film is trying to, you know, kind of being conscious of what it's doing, as you explained. So I felt that there was like a very, very interesting and very unique way of trying to merge also these approaches in a way that was really unique. And the other thing that I wanted to say is that this idea of conspiracy was also original, because we've heard a lot, of course, about internet conspiracy and the communities online who then kind of create these bubbles, conspiracy. But this idea of almost like a productive conspiracy, right? Which goes along with resisting the impulse of defining, organizing, categorizing, kind of submitting to the logic of computation as we know it. So yeah, I just wonder, like, if you could maybe say a little bit more about that, like how do you see this idea of a conspiracy, I guess unleashing an imagination that is you know, like connected to this idea of resistance. And then very finally, just a kind of a curiosity on where you stand in like this we've seen through the Wikipedia pages of Clodo, for example, that some of them term them as Luddite or neo-Luddite. But to me, it sounded to me, you just now said like it kind of shows a way of life. It's almost like maybe more closer to a Dadaist approach in the way that they kind of operate with a different maybe political, of course, conscience. But I don't know if you had some insight about that, or what your opinion is about yes, this form of operation.
Yeah, maybe I'll respond to the question around Luddites. So, you know, most of you probably have heard about Luddites, but like just briefly, they were workers in the early 1800s who were burning down the looms that were going to replace them on their workplace. So Luddites were kind of workers struggling against what we would today call technological unemployment. Not just unemployment, if it's not unemployment, then at least sort of reduced wages. And so what's interesting about Clodo is that they are, they may be kind of, you know, they were not just, they were talking very, they weren't attacking very sort of like the Luddites were attacking the very particular, they would go into a factory and they would only attack those looms that they assumed would replace them. Whereas what Clodo is doing is they are talking not about a very particular type of technology, they're talking about the logic of computation, right? They're talking about the sort of impulse towards ordering, categorizing, and structuring that is at odds with what they see as, you know, a life lived of kind of emancipation and release. And so there's something very different between the kind of the targets of the Luddites and the targets of Clodo. And so thinking of them as Luddites or even as kind of primitivists, because that's often how kind of today anti-technologists are described, as kind of primitivists who want to go back to an earlier stage. But Clodo themselves, again, in their self-interview wrote that they, you know, they have no desire whatsoever to go back into time. What they were attacking was a broad logic that wasn't just affecting their everyday lives, but also was informing military operations, policing operations, and that's what they were attacking. They weren't Luddites afraid of losing their job. So that's kind of like, that's how I would separate them from the Luddites or primitivists, or sort of the other reference points that people tend to use when they talk about kind of radical resistance to technology.
I would add that computers in their time were not consumer devices. And that's really the big difference between then and now, other than things of network infrastructure or other, you know, formal logistical issues. It's that there was not really a consumer internet. People did not have computers at home. Maybe some people used computers at the job, but they weren't even as popular as typewriters or anything else. And so they were used to create personnel files. They were doing logistical shipping operations for businesses, but they were also extensively used by a lot of the firms targeted here by the military for bombing computational tables and charts, and to help in missile programs, and to help develop new military technology. And so and the police were really starting to incorporate computation, first at the very large sort of FBI, National Bureau of Police levels first, and then slowly more integrated into regional and local police. And so for them, it was very clear that it was a technology that only benefited certain forms of power. Now that it is a consumer technology, it means that when people attack the internet in general, they're also preventing people from being able to talk to their families. They're keeping people from sharing pictures of children or dogs. And so there's a very different response to it. And I would say that basically consumers and everyday people are now being held hostage by these businesses and military by having them now be integrated to the same system of computation that originally was created to benefit. Very briefly on the issue of conspiracy, we don't like conspiracy theorists who talk about, you know, who want to bust or end the conspiracy of these ridiculous anti-Semitic sort of things. Instead, we want to encourage people who start and spread conspiracies. And in fact, radical political movements through history have always adopted anonymous names, have spread myths about themselves, have been cowboys, have been heretical priests, and everyone and everything in between. And so instead of stopping or ending conspiracies like contemporary conspiracy theory does, we're interested in contributing to these deep and long imaginations of what a conspiracy can be, and really leveraging the power and the fear and the paranoia that people have around them. And in fact, there were deep communist conspiracies like this in the 19th century, like Auguste Blanqui, who might be interesting reference points for people.
In fact, there's someone on the audience who's sent me a message saying that Clodo invented a nice word for this idea of computing in the service of policing. That was informaflic, flick being the police instead of the informatics. So it seems that we have someone in the audience who's been also looking into Clodo's history, and also like the way in which they use this or created these terminologies.
There's a very long history in France, like that I don't think you quite see in other kind of, regions of technocritique is sort of what they sort of broadly frame it, which is a sort of very long history of philosophers, cultural theorists writing about technology in a very, very critical way that precedes a lot of the kind of philosophers of technology that the Anglophone countries sort of tend to refer to. So Informaflick seems to fit perfectly within that radical lineage. I love that term.
Great. So I guess that maybe we can leave it here with that nice term created by Clodo. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's been really, really interesting to hear you explain and give us this like behind the scenes tour through the film and the work that you've done around Clodo and also about subversive techniques on computing.
Thank you also from my side, and also thanks to the audience who joined us in Zoom and Twitch or is watching this on YouTube. I just want to remind everybody we're going to be back, but not in 2 weeks, in a month on the 15th of June with another duo, a German collective called NeoZoon, looking at a lot of dark, creepy videos from YouTube and the relationship between humans and animals and their portrayal. So once again, thanks a lot, Thomas and Andrew, and thank you, everybody.